Tonight's event, we're going to be talking about strategies for big budget feature film development. And this is related to creating feature films with budgets that start around $500K and go up to $5 million. And the reason that this particular set of films kind of makes sense to group together is because when you're producing a $500,000 to $5 million project, by and large, you're going to have to raise money from investors, or you're going to have to work with banks. And there are, and it may be the case that you have to raise money using pre-sales or by pre-selling content or a project to distributors in order to get a minimum guarantee, or it could be the case that you're raising money by using film incentives for different states where they pay you to come to the state in order to film in their particular jurisdiction, and they give you a percentage of your budget back using a variety of different techniques. Whenever you're funding using those tools, you generally speaking have to do a certain set of things to persuade people that your project is worth investing in. Also, you're taking on greater risk because you're not just losing your money, you're losing investors' money, you're losing banks' money. and so the banks and investors and other people sort of have higher requirements than you might personally have for a passion project when it comes to turning over cash and providing funding. So that's why budgets from $500K to $5 million sort of fall into a similar classification. If you're going to want to produce less expensive projects, we have a set of resources that are designed for frugal producers and that sort of go from 10K to 100K. And those are the kinds of projects that you can do using only your own money, or, by raising money from a variety of different sources, which may not have the same set of requirements that the folks funding bigger projects have. The reason that this sort of stops around $5 million is that for an independent film producer, as you start getting above $5 million, as the budget for your project goes up, you start having to invite other people into your project as producers as well. So it could be the case that you want to do a $6 or $10 million project. Chances are you're not going to do that on your own as an independent producer. Chances are you're going to end up working with an established producer that has a deal with a studio or that has a deal with one of the big streaming services. And those folks are going to basically provide you with some or all of the funding that you need to produce the project. That's a whole different set of skills and a whole different set of partners in your project with different considerations. And you end up doing sort of different sets of things if we're talking sort of in generalities. So in this particular event, we're really just focusing on $500K to around $5 million. And we're not talking about the development stage of the project, which is the period of time where you're deciding whether or not you actually want to produce a particular project, whether or not the project is likely to be profitable. And if so, you start making the first steps and setting up the first arrangements that are required in order to produce the project. First thing that we're just sort of going to mention in passing, producing a feature film at the $500 to $5 million level is dangerous and expensive. It requires you to work with lawyers and CPAs and tax attorneys and banks and investors, as well as increasingly high value cast, crew, agents, and managers. So you're going to have to work with all of these people to get the final advice you need to produce your project. This event is meant as sort of a primer and it's fairly in-depth primer that dives into a lot of the topics and lingo that people use when they're talking about distribution, and it sort of gives you a skeleton or a structure that talks about how to make your project safer to produce and how to make your project easier to produce. And it's sort of one strategy that I think is a pretty solid one, in my personal opinion. And also, if you look at the resources that come with this particular project, you'll notice that a lot of the topics that we address in this particular event, they address in their particular event. They do talk about film analytics. They do talk about bankability. They do talk about making attachments. They do talk about working with distributors and buyers and getting pre-sales. So this workshop is specifically meant to be an on-ramp onto the process of doing development. As the I want to mention that as the budget for your film goes up, the people that you work with really do kind of have a serious passion about getting paid, and they feel like their money and their time and their reputation are very, very valuable. So you need to be aware that when you're producing one of these projects, that people care a lot about it. They're not forgiving. And it's perfectly possible to trash your reputation by trying to produce a project you're not ready to produce. And it's perfectly possible to involve yourself in litigation by making promises that you don't keep. The methods and options and strategies addressed in this particular workshop represent my opinions, and they're not going to be true for all projects or any specific project. Furthermore, you need to be aware that the industry changes really quickly. We've just gone through COVID, and the whole world changed. Like, for example, theatrical release hasn't been possible for a long time. We're not sure when and if and how it's going to come back, or we're not sure what the relationship between filmmakers and theaters is going to be, how distributors and filmmakers are going to be working together when it comes to theatrical release, whether or not theatrical release is going to be financially viable. When you become a producer, one of the things you do is you evolve with the times, and you seize opportunities that are created by the times, and you avoid problems that are created during a particular snafu in the economy, like a pandemic. One of the things that this workshop can help you do is figure out how to meet the kind of people who can help you navigate those waters as you're building your project. I don't want to drive people off from producing from the $500,000 to $5 million window. A lot of the people that are in my workshops have produced lots of projects. Many of them have produced $100,000, $200,000, $500,000 projects in the past, and they're sort of looking, but when they've happened, they may not have played a central role, or they've been involved in the project, and they may even have been theoretically the producer, but it came together in a very awkward way, in a very stressful way, and they're wondering if there's, they sort of were self-taught, and they need insight and advice into maybe a safer way or a faster way to build their film projects going forward. If I'm just saying, if you happen to have never produced anything in your life before, going through this workshop will be helpful because it'll give you an understanding of how to produce bigger budget projects. But your first project should not be a $500,000 project or a $5 million project. I mean, you can buy an apartment building for $5 million. And an apartment building may be a better investment because, generally speaking, they earn rents and so forth. Whereas, your film, you could produce it and nobody could buy it, or you could not arrange distribution for it, and it would be a dead weight loss. So having said all that, I don't want to drive you off. My objective is just to make sure that people are sort of solidly situated in reality. And this is specifically because I have watched people spend 5 or 6 years trying to produce a project, at the $4 or $5 million level. I've seen them make promises they couldn't keep. I have seen them move into litigation, and I have seen them spend tens of thousands of dollars they never got back. So one of the reasons I want to do this particular workshop is specifically to help people move forward on producing things, and move forward to producing things at the right budget level so they achieve their objectives personally, professionally, and creatively with less opportunity or with less risk than they might otherwise do. So as we dive into talking about development, I want to start with a statement a very famous quote by William Goldman, which is, "No one knows anything." Every film takes its own path from script to screen, and you're in Hollywood, wherein live many of the most attractive and charming, intelligent, wealthy, and driven people in the world. It is absolutely true that you could attach a particular person or a particular to your project, or you could acquire a particular piece of intellectual property that makes it very easy for you to pass through all of the gates that we're going to be talking about as we talk about doing development for your film. It's not that you won't have to meet all of the benchmarks that we'll be talking about in order to have a really successful project. It's just that it'll be really easy. If I have a new book written by J.K. Rowling, and it's like the next version of the Harry Potter story, talking about Harry's grandson, and it's like a science fiction story, chances are good I'm going to be able to get that thing turned into a $5 million film relatively quickly, specifically because there's such a huge market for that project. There's a huge market for the people who want the finished film in that instance, because people do know J.K. Rowling and because they do care about the Harry Potter series. Having mentioned that, I want to add that as you're going through your life in Hollywood and you're watching people work on producing their projects, you'll watch people break the rules and guidelines outlined in this blueprint frequently. If you happen to have 20% of the budget for your project in your pocket, and you've got that money ready and able to spend, you can make a lot of things happen really pretty quickly, because you can start attaching the right pieces to your project, and things go fast when you have the cash in your hand. So and that's something that, you may see people moving really quickly through the process of producing their film, and it's because they do have the cash in hand and because it allows them to buy the assets that they need. Furthermore, sometimes you'll watch people take a slightly different development strategy, and it'll sort of look like they're making a lot of projects, but you'll check back on them 2 or 3 years later, and you'll see that actually, even though theoretically they attached this particular named actor or acquired this particular screenplay that was supposed to be really high value, actually nothing really happened with it. They acquired a certain set of the assets, they moved through part of the development process, and then they just hung. Nothing happened after that. So you'll see people move forward on what look to be fast tracks. Sometimes you'll also see people who appear to be on a fast track who sort of just derail completely. The longer you've lived and worked here in Hollywood, the more you'll see that kind of thing. And as you're here long enough, one of the things that's interesting is you actually acquire the capacity to break a few rules and kind of fly through a few steps in the development process, specifically because you know people who are willing to work with you for free, that you trust, who are reputable, who are willing to share their assets and their resources and their expertise with you. That's part of longevity of being in the industry for a long time. And one of the reasons I talk about doing short projects first is because it can help you acquire some of those relationships. So when you move on to longer projects, you're not starting from scratch. You actually have business acumen and producing acumen and experience and contacts throughout the industry that know you and trust you, and that you know and trust. Generally speaking, there really are broad avenues down which most successful film projects walk. And knowing these broad avenues, knowing the sort of series of gates that a project passes through, makes it possible for you to get where you're going and helps you seize opportunities to move forward quickly when those happen to be available. You understand when something has a real value, you get a better idea of when somebody is bringing a lot to the table. You get an understanding of when working with a particular company will solve a bunch of problems. You are going to master a set of skills and a sort of a set of concepts that reduce your risks on producing a film. It reduces your risks and it maximizes the probability of you being successful. And it ensures that you have the pieces that you need in order to attach the right talent and the right key crew and the right partners to your project at the right time, which is the point of this particular exercise. It's so you see that there's a sort of a checklist you have to move through in order to get where you're trying to go. So now let's sort of dive into what development is. And I want to talk about the fact that development is a lot like a blueprint, creating a blueprint for building a house. There's like a million ways to build a house. But if you need to build a house and what you care about, if you need to build a house, what you care about is that there's at least one method that works reliably, right? You could totally go out, gather a bunch of wood, chop it up, and spend 2 or 3 years trying to fit it together and end up with something that look remotely like a log cabin that you might conceivably want to live in for a few hours or a few days, right? But if you want to build a house that's the kind of house that you can sell and that you can make a lot of money off of, chances are you're going to go ahead and move through the established procedures for building your particular house. You'll create a blueprint that outlines what the house should look like, and then you'll attach the right people to take the blueprint and turn it into a successful house or a successful apartment building if you're talking about spending $5 million. So almost every $500,000 K plus project is going to go through the development process that I'm talking about. The vast majority of them are going to end up going through all of the steps that I've talked about. And if they skip them, it's going to make them less likely to succeed, and it's going to make it so their project is less likely to make money. The set of slides we're going through is going to review sort of that set of steps. It's totally possible. It's absolutely legal for you to skip some of these development steps. But when you do, it's just harder to get loans, and it's harder to get investment. It's harder to get tax incentives, and it's harder to attach good people to your project. And if you know people who've had struggled for a long time to produce a project, chances are the reason they haven't been able to attach people to their project, and they haven't been able to acquire the money they need, and they haven't been able to do everything that they need to do in order to be successful, has a lot to do with the fact that they did bad development. Their project isn't developed enough and doesn't have the assets and resources it needs. The blueprint isn't good enough that they've created to go forward. People look at the blueprint and they go, that's not going to be a good house, and I don't want to waste time on it. If you go forward with bad development, generally speaking, you expect there to be problems. That's just the nature of trying to develop a house based upon a bad blueprint. So over the course of building a feature film project, especially at this budget level, you end up working with a bunch of different people. The way that you attach people to your project is by doing good development and basically creating a good plan for a profitable film and proving that the plan is good using things like film analytics and bankability reports, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to end up working with a UPM or line producer. Generally speaking, I recommend that people work with a line producer. You attach a line producer in the earliest days of your project in order to do budgets and shooting schedules and so forth. A UPM, generally speaking, only works once it's a unit production manager, so they go start working with you. Generally, when you go into pre-production, a line producer works with you before you, from the very first days when you barely just have a screenplay, all the way to the end of the project when you start paying out investors. So a line producer is kind of like a partner that you adopt in your production, adopt and pay, I should say, who works with you for the whole course of the production. And generally speaking, they've got lots of credits, and you don't have many, but they got a lot. And the fact that they have a lot of credits makes you more credible. You may attach a casting director to help you attach the right talent. You a lot of times will work with bank film finance companies who give you money for production. Though if you have sold $1 million pre-sales for your particular film, you found 4 or 5 people who are willing to give you a total of $1 million to produce your film, the bank will often give you 75% or 80% of it, or who knows how much, a significant percentage of it that you can use to actually produce the film. You might work with equity investors who take a risk, and they say, well, you've got like a $5 million film here, you sold $1 million worth of equity, and you've got another $1 million coming to you in rebates. I'm going to go ahead and give you the rest of the money you need to produce the film, and because I believe that you'll be able to sell the rights to this film or license this film for well over $5 million going forward, and I want a percentage of the profit that you earn. You will also be working with key actors that make your film worth more money. And the reason that they make your film worth more money is because distributors like them, and distributors like them because audiences like them, right? Everybody likes Harrison Ford, or almost everybody likes Harrison Ford or Tom Hanks. And because we humans out here who buy tickets and buy streaming services like Tom Hanks, when Tom Hanks attaches to your project, the distributors and streaming companies like your project better, and that helps you sell your project. So actors can be very important. Some actors can be very important to ensuring the success of your project. You will work with distributors, and you'll want them to give you a minimum guarantee or a promise that if you deliver a particular film that meets their specifications, that they will actually pay you as soon as the film is available. And that will result in that pre-sale, that negotiated deal is one of the things that you use to get money. So we're gonna dive into the process of doing film development, but part of the process is to attach all of these people to your project. This team is what will actually produce your film. in addition to the rest of the cast and the rest of the crew. So you need these key players, and in order to get them aboard, you have to do good development. I want to just put a quick mention in, because if you haven't actually worked in business for a long time, if you're not an experienced producer or you're not an experienced entrepreneur, you may have heard people use the words film finance and film equity, and you may not really have quite understood the difference between these two things. And you really do need to understand the difference between these two things. Finance means that people are lending you money to produce your project, and the amount that they're lending you has to do with how many distributors have offered you a minimum guarantee, how much money you're going to get from state production incentives, and basically it's how much money you can borrow based against these assets, which are part of what the film is going to generate in terms of revenue. So finance is always a loan. Equity means individuals or organizations, they give you money because they want a percentage of the back end on your particular film. They want a percentage of your profits. Generally speaking, people who lend you money, like banks, for example, they get paid back first. Equity gets paid back the money it invests afterwards. So if a bank lends you $1 million and then you get $1 million from an investor, then when money comes in, the first $1 million goes to the bank, the second $1 million goes to the investor, and then usually you give the investors a premium. They might get 20% or 30% of the next, of the next money that comes in. So they might get $1.3 million before you start making any money, because you're rewarding them upfront more for taking a risk on you. Film finance and film equity usually work together when you're producing a film at this budget level. You need both. So it's not just that you need money from investors, you also need money from lenders. So I hope you understand that. We'll talk about it more going forward, but you need to understand that there's two different kinds of money that come into your company when you're producing this kind of film. Let's talk about the first step in development. It's script acquisition. There's several different ways to acquire a screenplay. The easiest way is by writing one. The second way to get one is by buying one. And the third way to get one is by optioning one. Now, when you option a screenplay, it's not that you give the author $1 and then he gives you an option on a screenplay. What you need is an option agreement that specifies exactly how much you're going to pay that guy to get his entire all the rights to his screenplay, so you can produce your particular project. The full contract for an option agreement is necessary because you can't really dive into making promises to particular banks or to particular investors that you're going to be able to produce a particular screenplay for a particular price if you don't know how much the screenplay is going to cost when all is said and done. If you're going to be writing a screenplay, you actually kind of save money because you've written the screenplay and you own the screenplay lock, stock, and barrel. And when that's the case, you want to register the screenplay at the Copyright Office to prove that you actually own it. You're going to want to work with an attorney to make sure that the screenplay that you've written and that you've registered is, if you've built it based upon incorporating the names of famous people or famous events or something like that, you're going to want to make sure that the screenplay is okay to produce, which is something you'll probably want to do with any screenplay that has those kind of famous elements attached to it. But you do save money. I mean, getting a screenplay can cost like $100,000, $200,000. If you can write a good screenplay, then it's really handy to be able to write something that saves you a bunch of money and that you owe 100% and that you can do anything you want with. So it's worth, if you happen to be a screenwriter, one of the reasons screenwriters or writer producers have done so well recently is because they kind of get past this first step, which is acquiring a screenplay really quickly. One thing I would mention, in theory, one can find a book that one really likes, one can option the book, and then one can hire a screenwriter of your choice to turn the book into a screenplay. And you'll notice if you were to go to donedealpro.com and take a look at transactions that have been done over the course of the last 6 months or a year, you'll see producers are constantly acquiring books to turn into screenplays. And it is specifically because they like the book plot and characters and so forth. They like the fact that the book has an audience, and they like the fact that they can hire their own favorite screenwriter to do the writing, who will work on the terms that they like and will create the kind of screenplay that they want. So that's kind of another way to get a screenplay, is to take a book and turn it into a screenplay using your favorite writer. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to vet the screenplay, because just because you like a particular screenplay doesn't mean that it's good enough to produce. You want to take the screenplay that you've acquired or that you've purchased or that you've written or you've had written, and you're going to take it to professional readers. And we have a company, one of the resources that we have in our set of resources is a company called We Screenplay, and you can hire 3 or 5 readers to read a particular screenplay and give you their notes on it. And you can even specify that you want the readers to have experience working for production companies, or you want them to have previous experience working with active production companies. You can make requests to get exactly the kind of feedback that you want. But you want to work with a professional reader. You want them to vet the screenplay. You want to find out what they like and what they hate about it. And if there's things that they hate about it, particularly if multiple readers hate it, you want to fix the screenplay. The reason is that you're going to be taking your screenplay over the rest of the development process and sending it out to all kinds of people. You're going to be sending it to producers reps and sales agents and talent reps, talent agents who work with the actors you want to hire. You're going to be sending it out to investors. And a lot of those people are going to take your screenplay and hand it over to a reader. And if the professional reader that they have hates it, then the chance of you getting support from those people goes down dramatically. So your screenplay has to be professional reader friendly. And the only way that that's going to happen is if you take your screenplay, submit it to professional readers, get their notes, make the required changes, or figure out why you don't have to make those required changes, and and come up with a really good excuse how it's not necessary. Because generally speaking, every single person that you work with, that you want to attach to your project, the vast majority of them are going to hire professional readers or have professional readers, or are going to agree with professional readers about your particular project. I mentioned in passing that sending your work out to professional readers, getting notes back from like 5 or 10 of them, which is not very expensive, and then incorporating those notes into your screenplay really does tend to improve it a lot. It tends to make it actually significantly better. And that's because professional readers, generally speaking, know what they're talking about. The next thing you're going to do is identify 10 other recently produced films, which means in the last 3 years or thereabouts, which is difficult. I mean, I guess we could say 4 years because of COVID, but really in the last 3 years, that have scripts that are in the same genre, made at the same budget level, and with the same level of talent that you envision working with in your particular project. You need to find comparable projects. No one's really going to do that for you. It's the kind of thing you think a distributor would do for you, or a film analytics company would do for you, but they, generally speaking, are not going to do that. They're going to make you pick out the comparable projects. And the reason is they may have a screenplay, they may have your short description for what the screenplay is about, your synopsis and so forth, but they really can't tell what you see in your head until you can point them to 10 other projects. You say, well, my project's like these other projects. Like my project is like The Conjuring, and it's like The Awakening, and it's like 5 other different horror pictures, right? When you take your project and you put it amongst these other projects that are very similar, they don't just pick up information about the story. They get an idea of what the project looks and feels like as well. And that's really important to them. It helps them envision your project even before you've created it. And it gives them a notion of how high your production values are going to be, what the quality of your talent is going to be, and what target market the film is going to be aimed at. right? If you were to take a look at It, right, the movie It, clearly the movie It could have been made to be very terrifying. It could have been, a really hard R script. It involves kidnapping children and torturing and killing them. It's pretty terrifying. But really, when all said and done, it kind of is more like Sixth Sense in that even a child, children die, but generally speaking, it's not so horrifying or so gory that it's competing with Saw, So I just mentioned that you learn a lot from hearing what a filmmaker says their project is similar to. So you're going to pick out 10 recently produced films that are available on streaming or available in theatrical release, except there's been no theatrical release, that are available, released on streaming within the last 3 years. And that's going to help people understand your project, understand your target market, and understand your project's look and feel. Now, another good reason to take your stuff, your screenplay, and submit it to readers is the first time you submit your screenplay to readers, they're going to come back with notes that are not very favorable. And they're going to, usually they'll give they'll say pass or recommend. And most of the time they'll say pass. They'll say, look, if I was a producer, I would pass on this project. Once you incorporate their notes and you send it out to a new flock of readers, they're going to come back with, this is much better. This is really good. I kind of like this. I like this. This is really well written. And by the time you've done that 3 times, you've gone through 3 batches of readers, you're going to get a lot of readers who say recommend. And they're going to say, this is a great screenplay because, the female characters are very strong, or it really is very terrifying, or this looks like it'd be a great project for kids, or this looks like a great low cost tentpole movie, or this looks like a great piece for an actor that needs to break out. When you get those comments from readers, that's something that you can actually incorporate into your business plan. So another reason to go through the hassle of having professional readers read your screenplay is you can actually incorporate those kind words that you get from them and the recommends that you get. You'll get those given to you, and you'll be able to use them when you're creating your documentation and reaching out to people via email and so forth. You can say, hey, this project was recommended by 6 professional readers. I'm including their comments. I hope you find them interesting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I just want to mention the topic. People always ask, when do I set up my company? Going to the hassle of setting up a company when you don't know you're going to do a project doesn't really make a lot of sense. On the other hand, when you have to acquire a screenplay, generally speaking, you want the screenplay to be something that your production company, if you set one up, is going to own. So when you work with a entertainment attorney, which you will do if you're going to buy a screenplay or pay to have one written for you, or if you're going to option one, when you're working with a attorney, he'll advise you on whether or not you have to set up a production company or whether or not you can basically put your name on the agreement and then transfer your right to be able to opt to your ownership of the particular screenplay or your ownership of the option to the production company that you may set up in the future. If I just mentioned that because you want to work with an attorney to acquire the screenplay or to buy one or have one written for you. You want to work with an attorney to do that because it's important who owns those rights, and it's important who controls those rights, and it's important whether or not those rights are transferable. So you need to work with an attorney to sort of handle those particular issues. I will mention in passing that if you were working on multiple projects, there are people who set up something called a development company. And you'll hear people talk about development companies. A development company is a company somebody sets up when they want to develop multiple projects. And what the development company does is it goes through the development process in acquiring the screenplays, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it goes through the magic set of steps that I'm going to review with you. And then when the time is right and they decide that they're going to greenlight a project, they take the stuff that they've acquired for a particular project, and the development company transfers it to the production company that gets set up to produce the project. So That's what a development company is. A development company is something that takes that usually is developing multiple projects, and it just spins them out into actual production companies when they're ready to go into production, ready to become films. You're probably not going to be doing that, but if you're successful producing films at this budget level, chances are good you will be setting up a development company at some point in the future, I think. So you've acquired the screenplay. Now we're on to the next step. You're going to get film analytics done for your particular project because you need to get an understanding of how much the film can actually make when it's sold. Film analytics companies are companies, they're people who do statistical analysis on the performance of films based upon a series of criteria. They care about budget, they care about genre, they care about director, they care about actors, and they care about other people that are attached to the project as well. They take these factors about a particular project and they compare it against they take the 10 films that you say your film is similar to, and they do a analysis to determine what the likely financial value of your project will be from all financial sources, like from all the buyers that you'll be working with going forward. And they give you an idea of sort of how much your film is likely to make, so you can decide whether or not you want to make it. It's a big step. If the film analytics company says, okay, you want to spend $5 million on this particular project, we estimate based upon all the similar projects that you've given us and based upon the amount that you're planning on spending and the directors and the talent that you're thinking about attaching, we estimate that you're going to make, this film could make $30 million in distribution. Well, that's good news because it means that your film's very likely to make money. The film analytics company says based upon, and they provide, statistical information. They help you, they kind of state, based upon our analysis and based upon the statistical information we have about your project and the competing projects, we think that this is how much you're going to make. And furthermore, they also provide a forecast, generally speaking, of when that money is likely to come in. They can also provide you with a list of the distributors that are most likely to distribute your particular project. They may charge extra for that, but they know, based upon your film, based upon the comparable projects, who the likely distributors for the project are. They can usually create a short list of where the rights are going to be sold. So you can ask them, to provide you with that information or that insight. They also provide you with a cash flow report, which gives you an estimate not just of how much money is coming in, but when it's likely to come in. Because if you decide to produce a film today and it's going to cost $5 million, chances are it's not going to be done for 3 or 4 years. And then, the question becomes, well, when is the investor likely to get his money back? Well, you like to think that if the film is released, 2 years from today or 2.5 years from today, that they're going to be getting their money back starting about 3 years from today. And they might be getting, and that money might continue over the course of, 6 or 12 years. For example, The Conjuring, Amityville Horror is still earning money because it's available for sale on a whole bunch of different platforms. The cool thing about producing a film is that the revenue continues over a prolonged period of time. And you can arrange to sell all of your rights to a particular company and take sort of a cash out, and then that company will make additional money going forward. Or you can decide you're going to hold on to your film and you're going to continue making little deals for it in the months and years to come. And that will get the money coming directly to you. Furthermore, if you happen to create something really good, you might decide to produce multiple films. It's really great when you create something that can become a franchise. That's how you end up with weird things like, Amityville Horror 1, Amityville Horror 2, Amityville Horror 3, or Saw 1, Saw 2, Saw 3. So film analytics helps you figure out how much money's coming in and how much when the money is likely to hit people's bank accounts. It will also tell you if you should not be producing this particular film. If the film analytics company says, look, based upon the criteria that you've given us and based upon the screenplay, based upon all of these issues, when we think of, when we compare this to other projects that have been successful, your film, you say that you're going to spend about $5 million to produce your film. And we can tell you that it's very likely not to make more than $2 million at the box office because of these characteristics. And then you can decide whether or not you want to change those characteristics for this particular film. The information, the financial information that you get from this process helps you make good decisions about your particular project. It gives you a good thumbnail understanding of your project. I mentioned in passing that one of the resources that comes with this particular event is from Nash Information Systems, and it talks about bankability. They can give you a report which tells you which directors and which other key crew members you might want to attach to your project have been the best investment for producers. So if you look at that particular recorded workshop, you'll see that they track every director on every kind of film, every DP, every sound designer. They just hundreds of professionals, I should say tens of thousands of professionals across tens of thousands of projects. So they can tell you if you need a director for your particular project. They can give you a short list and say, look, based upon the 10 projects that you want to do, these 5 or 10 directors are probably your best bets in terms of, if you invest $100,000 in this guy, you're likely to get $500,000 or $1 million more in revenue, because his projects statistically have made this much money at box office, and he's worked on projects, at your particular budget level, which means he's getting paid what you normally pay directors that work on this kind of project. So bankability reports might be something that you do in order to help you choose the right cast and crew going forward. Once you've gone through that process and you've sort of done the film analytics, you've talked about budget, you've talked about the budget you're planning to shoot at, you've talked about what the recommended budget should be based upon what their statistics say. And at that point, you are going to contact a line producer. You're going to hire a line producer. Chances are that means you're going to end up interviewing like 10 of them that have worked on similar projects. You're going to find 1 or 2 or 3 that you really like, and you're going to hire 1 or 2 or 3 of them to create a budget shooting schedule or day out of days. Now, the reason that you may want to hire multiple line producers is, even though it's expensive, it's possible that if you may benefit from having multiple line producers' takes on how you want to produce your project. Alternatively, you may find working with them to create the budgets and the shooting schedules and seeing how they work and how friendly they are and how fast they are gives you a good idea of whether or not you personally want to work with them on a project. It doesn't really cost a huge amount of money to hire a line producer to create a budget for you. It's not super cheap, but you might spend $5,000 or $3,000 to hire them to create a budget shooting schedule and day out of days for your project. And it might make sense for you to hire multiple line producers to do that. I'm assuming that if you're engaging in this process, that you have 20% of your budget up front, or at least enough to be able to go through a lot of development before you have to start looking for money. And attaching a good line producer is a really big deal. Now, if you don't know what a budget shooting schedule or day out of days are, there's a list. One of the resources that comes with this particular event talks about what a budget shooting schedule and day out of days are. But basically, it's the cost of shooting your film. And what the line producer does is they go through each scene and they find out, what location is it shot at, what actors have to be there, what special effects are there, what locations do we need, and what props do we need, etc. And they put all of that information into a budgeting application that lets them figure out what the total cost of shooting each scene is. Then they also organize the scenes so that if we're shooting at the dairy 5 days, we have 5 different scenes shot at the dairy, we're going to shoot them all in 2 days. And if we have 10 shots at the house, we're going to shoot them all on one particular week. So they basically make it so your film's shot as efficiently as possible. And they create, after that, a day out of days where they figure out how many actors they need on each day. And you need the day out of days information, because when you start approaching talent to be in your project, you need to be able to tell them, we need to have your actor available to us for 13 days over 3 weeks. And we need to have this actor available to us for 5 days over 1 week. So the day you need this information in order to attach talent and in order to make sure that your film can be produced at a budget that will be profitable. So by the time you get done with the film analytics process, you know what the budget has to be. And then you go to the line producer and say, hey, they say that if I can produce this project for $4 million, it'll be profitable. Can we produce this project for $4 million? The line producer can go through and do the math and see if it's possible to produce your project for $5 million. And if so, how many days you'll be shooting and which actors will be working on which days and what locations you'll be requiring, right? So step 3 is to get the budget and the shooting schedule. Now, as the budget for your project goes up, you're probably going to want to hire a bondable line producer. When you work with a bank and you're working on a $5 million project, the bank wants to make sure, absolutely sure, that this film is going to be finished, because it knows if the film is not finished, it's impossible to be profitable. If your film falls out of production and it never gets finished, there's nothing to sell. So the bank is determined that your film is going to finish production. So it makes you get a completion bond, which is an insurance policy that you buy, usually from the same people that sell you film insurance. And the completion bond guarantees that once you start production, if anything happens, your director dies, your lead actor dies, the village that you were shooting at gets blown up, the completion bond company will step in and actually finish the project. So it's a guarantee that your film will finish production, an absolutely cast iron guarantee that your film is going to finish production, because these people will step in and finish it, and you pay for that insurance policy. And the completion bond company is also going to be looking at your budget, your shooting schedules, your day out of days, and all this other information. Generally speaking, a good line producer has good relationships with particular completion bond companies. The reason is the line producer has produced similar projects to your project at similar budget levels, and they've had success in the past. They've gotten through production without having to rely on the completion bond company. So the completion bond company trusts them, and that makes the bank trust them, and that makes your investors trust them. Everybody trusts this line producer because they can get a completion bond, right? So getting a completion bond for a project that's under $3 million is usually, generally speaking, more expensive than getting one percentage-wise than one for a larger budget project like a $5 million project. And that's because the completion bond company has more budget to work with. It's taking less of a risk when you have a larger budget production, because instead of only having $3 million to spend to finish things up, they have $5 million. It's just, they have more money to work with. You're not going to get a completion bond for a $500,000 or $1 million project, generally speaking. You can contact completion bond companies, and we do interview an insurance, a guy that actually works with a company that provides completion bonds. And you can see that he talks about this. You can certainly reach out to him and confirm whether or not your film is likely to be able to get a completion bond based upon your budget. But your line producer is the one that has to qualify. It's him they actually trust more than they trust anybody else. And that's because his job is to make sure that the project goes through from start to finish. Step 4 is you decide whether or not you're going to go forward with producing this particular project. By the time you've gone through acquiring the script and vetting the script, you've worked with the film analytics company, and you've worked with a line producer or two to figure out what the budget would be for shooting this particular project. And you've determined where you're going to shoot it, whether it's here in California or in Atlanta or in Louisiana or even in Canada, wherever you're planning on shooting this particular project. you have a good idea with whether or not this project is likely to make money and how risky it is and how easy or hard it's going to be to make. If you decide to go forward at this point, you're going to start really spending a lot of money on lawyers and CPAs and tax advisors. You're going to be setting up that LLC. You're going to be attaching your key cast and crew. You're going to be hiring a producer's rep or sales agent to start doing pre-sales for your project. You're going to be working with banks to get loans based against pre-sales and against the film incentives you may be getting. And you're going to be hiring a securities attorney if you're going to be raising money from investors. Could be, depending on the level of your budget project, it could be that you don't do all of these things. If you have a $500,000 project, it may be that you can't get funding from a bank because you can't guarantee production. So you're just going to be getting money from investors. But regardless, once you decide that you want to go or no go based upon this information, you're really going to start spending money if you decide to go forward. You need to ask yourself at this point, do I want to make this film enough to take on this set of obligations? Am I really committed to this particular project? Am I willing to do what's necessary to get it done and to make sure that it's profitable? Am I willing to spend years on producing this project? Because it's a really big decision. And I want to pause just for a second and say, if you're a screenwriter, you may have been really frustrated at how long it takes for a project to sort of quote unquote get greenlit. The reason it takes a long time for projects to get greenlit is because they're risky. So people really have to fall in love with your project in order to decide to produce it. If they don't fall in love with it, if they're not in love with it, they won't produce the project. And it's at this step, after they've done the fundamental analyses and the fundamental budgeting calculations, it's at this point that they decide whether or not they want to go forward with the project. And when you're producing your own projects, you'll have to decide, do I like this project enough to proceed with? That means that when you're first deciding to invest in a project, you should be planning to spend maybe $10,000 or $15,000 or more to do this part, to get to this step 4, because film analytics costs a certain amount of money, and getting a budget and shooting schedule costs a certain amount of money, and hiring people to vet the screenplay costs a certain amount of money, and you'll probably end up consulting with attorneys during this process as well. So you have to have some spare cash to make that initial investment, and you have to be willing to walk away from it if it turns out this isn't really such a great project for you to be working on. If you decide to go forward, the next step is you're going to start consulting with experts on how you're going to put together the financing for this particular project. It's at this point that you usually end up contacting a producer's rep or a sales agent who's done pre-sales for projects in your budget and genre before. You're going to interview several of these guys, and you're going to hire the best one. And you want to ensure that they're actually going to be able to get you pre-sales. You're going to talk with them about who you think you're going to hire for your key cast, for your director, and you're going to get their feedback on what's necessary for them to sell your work, like what has to be in the project that's going to make it so your project sells well. If you don't know the difference between a producer's rep and a sales agent, a producer's rep comes on very early in a project, and they stay with you through the whole project, and you pay them pretty much like you pay a casting director. You pay them a fee to work with you over the course of the project. When you work with a sales agent, it could be the case that they don't get paid by you. They don't get a salary from you, but they get a much larger percentage of the back end of the film. If you interview some producers reps and some sales agents, the more that you interview, particularly that have experience in your genre, you can get an idea of how effective they are, whether or not you want to work with them, and the terms under which they're willing to work. You are going to talk to your line producer and your producer's rep, and you're going to talk about pre-sales and state incentives, because the producer's rep is going to be pre-selling your work, trying to get deals up in front before production, contracts that you can actually take to a bank and borrow money against. And your line producer may say, hey, look, if we shoot this thing in New Mexico, we can get, of your $5 million budget, we can get maybe $1 million back. Or if we shoot this in Georgia, or if we shoot this in New Orleans, we can get, 1.2 or $1.5 million of your budget back. So these two people will give you the information that you need to take to helps you decide how much money you're going to be able to get loans against. In many cases, line producers and producers reps may have relationships with bankers, and we do actually interview a banker that wants you to reach out early on in your process. His name's Adrian Ward. Go ahead and watch the interview with him, and you'll see that he talks about the things that he needs in order to give you money before your film is finished in order to fund production. After you figure out how much money you can borrow, you'll then have an idea of how much money you need to raise from investors. And you can then talk to a securities attorney about whether or not you should do a Regulation CF or a Regulation D private placement. And we have interviews with slated.com where you can basically post your project, and if the securities, you've worked with a securities attorney to create a private placement memorandum, which is an offering to investors, they can go ahead and say, they actually have something called an executive producer program where they can actually introduce you to investors, and that's something you might want to take a look at. But their platform also introduces you to investors. People are funding projects using wefunder.com. And if you've chosen the right intellectual property, like let's say you were lucky enough to get J.K. Rowling's next book and you were going to be able to make a film about it, that alone, choosing the right kind of project can really make getting funding on something like WeFunder relatively easy. Because if people recognize the name, they're investing in lots of films on those platforms. It becomes easier to raise money when you have a project that's pretty guaranteed to be popular. So step 5 is where you start putting together your financing plan and figuring out what has to be in place in order for you to finance your particular project. Long about now, you have enough to really start working on your business plan. Some people say, well, should I hire people to write my business plan for my film? The truth is that if you're going to be a producer, you should be able to write up a business plan because they really don't have a lot of information in them. If you were to go and look at most business plans that actually get funding, you'd be shocked at how short they are. You've just gone through the process, steps 1 through 5, and 1 through 6, you've gone through the process of getting film analytics done, doing comps, getting kind words from readers. You've pretty much you've collected all of this information that you can incorporate into your particular business plan that explains, look, this film, the film analytics company says this thing's likely to work money. I've got a line producer who's produced a bunch of projects in a similar genre. I've got a producer's rep on board who sold lots of projects. This is the director that we're going to go after. This is you really start having a really good idea of what your plan is going to look like. And creating the business plan is really just writing down the stuff that you already know. Now, you're not going to take your business plan and show it to investors to get money. Your securities attorney is going to make you have an offering document, and it's different for Regulation D versus Regulation CF, but your securities attorney is going to create a document that you take around to investors, and the business plan that you have will be sort of an attachment to it. You can't just walk around your business plan and ask for money when it's an investment, because it's like illegal, right? You have to have disclosure documents. There's a set of rules that govern this. And you can learn more about those by watching the resources that are available with this particular workshop. The reason that you need a business plan is because investors do want to know what your plan is. They do want to, you're going to want to tell them about the film analytics that you've done. You're going to want to tell them about the kind words you got from readers. You're going to want to tell them about your line producer and the director that you're going to attach or that you've made an offer to. You're going to want to tell them about all of these things. So you're going to start writing your business plan right about now, and you'll be continuing to refine it all the way up until you have full funding and you're rolling into pre-production, right? So it's kind of, the business plan tends to evolve over the course of the project, but you usually start writing it about now because you have a lot of information that people care about. Like banks may want to have this information. You kind of create the business plan to tell people all this junk. Now, by this time in the process, you've done all the film analytics, you've got the budget, you've got the shooting schedule, you've got a line producer's aboard, and you've got a producer's rep aboard. And producer's rep has told you who he thinks of the people that you're thinking about bringing on board as a director, who he thinks the best director, most sellable director is. And when you've interviewed the directors, you usually have a pretty good idea from them who they think they'd want to attach in terms of talent. A lot of times they have relationships with those people. So at that point, you start actually attaching people. You work with an attorney to offer people contracts, and the contracts have in it the terms under which people can be hired and fired, how much they're going to get paid every week. It has releases because you're going to be putting them on camera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It has the rules that they have to follow in terms of behavior. It has information in about when you have to let them go, what kind of things are likely to get them let go, or, you know, can you fire them at will, et cetera. So you work with an attorney to hire all these people, and you're going to, at that point, you're also going to find yourself a payroll company or an employer of record company. You'll use these people to pay the folks in your company because it saves time and it saves money. You know, it's relatively inexpensive to use a payroll company, or better yet, an employer of record to hire these folks. And for a couple of reasons. One, as you go through this process, when you're working on a film at this budget level, chances are you're going to have to sign the SAG-AFTRA and or IATSE contracts because you're going to have to be a union production. Once you become a union production, the unions actually really like when you're working with established entertainment industry payroll companies or employer of record companies like Entertainment Partners or ABS. Like when you're working with these established companies, they know that those companies are familiar with how to take dues out. They're familiar with how to pay people legally in different states, you know, because a lot of these companies can pay people in multiple states and multiple countries. And this solves a lot of problems for you as a producer. It solves a lot of problems for the unions as well. So particularly when you're working with SAG, they will often require you to put up a bond for when you're hiring their actors for how much you're likely to pay them over the course of your project. And it may be as high as you have to put in a bank or a bond. You have to buy a bond for up to 100% of how much you are going to pay them. And if you're working with a payroll company, especially an established payroll company, they're likely to make that bond price lower. Now, there are companies that will lend you the money that you need to buy the bond. There's a company called Bonded, actually, that does that. There's a couple of different companies. You can look around for them. But working with an employer of record company reduces the costs of the bond, and it makes it so hiring people is relatively easy, and it hires people nationwide, and they handle paying everybody, and they handle all the tax forms, and they have tools that make it easy to handle the how many hours people work and whether or not they're getting paid for overtime and are they getting their meal breaks and all that stuff. It solves a lot of problems for you. They also have built-in workers' comp insurance, which is important. It's something that you have to provide when people are working for you. And when you're hiring an employer of record company, they provide the workers' comp insurance, and they get better rates than you can get unemployment, the same kind of coverage from, generally speaking. Generally, in the earliest stages of the hiring process, you start by hiring the director, one or two key cast members, the DP or cinematographer, the editor, a production designer, the post-production supervisor, because these key members can usually tell you can usually determine who else to hire. They usually have teams of people that work with them. They usually have direct relationships with people. Now, it could be the case that you want to hire a casting director as well, but usually if you've attached a director, you will contact the one or two key cast members, like the quote unquote name talent. You and the director will contact the name talent. You may not use a casting director for that process because the director will be relatively seasoned, and it'll be the director that the key cast members are deciding to work with. when you fill out the rest of your team, you're hiring the rest of the actors, you might well work with the casting director, because they can do things like cold auditions. They'll have read the screenplay, they'll know who the people in the project are supposed to be, and what the characters are supposed to be, and they can actually run the auditions and then just bring you people to fill in the remaining roles, right? And they'll also be cognizant of where you're working. Are we shooting in Atlanta? Because if we can hire people locally there, that's good. If we're shooting in New Mexico or in Louisiana, that'll be good, because we'd rather hire people locally. And so casting directors, there's different casting directors across the entire nation, and you may decide to work with them to hire them for particular projects. Usually casting directors don't like to come on board your project unless you have you have a start date, you have the majority of your budget already in place. They don't like to come on early in a project. They tend to like to come on later in a project. They can come on earlier, but they prefer not to. It's more expensive, and they're taking more of a risk, because when a casting director reaches out to people on a project that doesn't look anywhere near close to getting funded, they know that they're taking a huge risk with their reputation. So we get to step 9. At this point, you've got a lot of critical elements in place, and you probably have most of your funding in place as well. You've got the budget, you've got the film analytics, the budget, the shooting schedule, the day out of days, the producer's rep, the line producer. You know where you're going to be shooting. You have your director, you have the key talent in place. You know how you're going to get the rest of the actors on board. And you've also figured out how much money you're going to be getting from banks, and you have an idea of how much money you're going to be getting from investors, and you've talked to the securities attorney, so you have the correct documents to reach out to investors. And you have platforms like slated.com or wefunder.com or any of the other Reg D or Reg CF platforms where you can find investors who are looking for your particular kind of project. You've got a production designer on board who can help you come up with artwork that you can use when you're pitching your project. And you've got people on board who can help you lock down any other particular details you need to lock down in order to start saying, okay, we're now going to go forward into pre-production. That means we're going to actually start setting up to produce this project. Usually that means renting offices. It means you start acquiring the locations. You start setting up times for people to travel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You want to make sure that, generally speaking, it's ideal, most ideal, when you have all of your production money in place before you enter pre-production. You have all your funding in place. Sometimes a film will enter into pre-production and will start rolling into production before it has 100% of its revenue in place, but it knows that it's going to be able to get it because the producer's rep says, hey, this money isn't in the bank yet, but this film is really sellable, and I have pitched it to like 30 different people, and I'm just waiting for them to actually say go or no go on giving you pre-sales. Or you have investors who say, yeah, I'm really interested. As soon as you start pre-production, I'll go ahead and invest. I just want to make sure this is real before I tie up capital, or whatever. Who knows what the issues are. You want to be able to make sure that you finish the film, because you have to be able to meet your obligations to banks and to cast and to crew and to lenders, etc. You cannot have a film stop in production and not get finished. It's the worst possible thing, because you can't sell part of a film. Now, a common question that comes up, what if I don't have 20% of my budget in place in order to start this process? What if I don't have 20%? I want to do a $5 million project and I don't have $1 million in the bank. Unless you're a wealthy person, producing a $500,000 plus project really has to be about making money. It has to be a well-considered investment of your time and your money and your intellectual property. It's not something you do on a whim. It's not something that you do because you are hopeful or aspirational, or because you're on some sort of overarching mission, spiritual mission, right? When you want to do a less expensive project, like a $10,000 project or a $100,000 project, you're taking a risk, but it's not going to ruin your life, right? You're not going to do something that's going to tie you up for years. It's not going to involve you in, it's probably not going to involve you in litigation unless you're doing something really crazy. I mean, it's kind of a manageable, aspirational thing. By the time you're getting up to $500,000 projects, and especially by the time you get into $5 million projects, the only reason to be producing that project is money. It could be the case it has a lot of other benefits, but your focus has to be producing a profit. Just like if you were producing an apartment building, right? Nobody builds aspirational apartment buildings. Nobody says to themselves, I want to go build an apartment building because I really can envision this great apartment building. They just don't do that because it's $5 million and because there's a lot of risks and because they're making a lot of promises to a lot of people, and those people care about making money. So if you don't have 20% of your budget to start this process in the bank, you want to really start thinking about, one, whether or not you can get that 20%, and if so, who you're going to get it from. And it has to be somebody who is willing to part with that money for 3 to 5 years and isn't going to be mad if you don't pay them back. Like they're willing to be your very first investor, or somebody who's willing to give you a big gift for no reason. Maybe they share your vision. I don't know. So if you can't get that 20%, you're going to start thinking about producing a lower cost project, producing a podcast, producing a play, writing and marketing a book, and doing doing something else to achieve that sort of spiritual objective. Now, the interesting thing is, it could be the case that deciding to produce a play, because, there's a lot of independent plays that have actually turned into films, deciding to produce a play is not a bad way to make it so your project has the audience it needs to become a $500,000 or $5 million project, right? Producing a book, right? If let's say that you don't have enough money to produce your $5 million project, you don't have you don't have $1 million or $100,000 in your pocket, but you do have $10,000. Well, I'll tell you what, writing a book and spending $10,000 to market it, if you market it well, it's really likely you're going to end up with a huge following for that particular book. I mean, it's going to be a good launch. And it could well be the case that if the book is a really good book, it could well be the case that the book actually creates the market that you need in order to produce a larger project. It's possible. So put the money where it's going to actually do the most good and where it's likely to turn into something profitable. Don't take a flying risk and decide to blow a huge quantity of money in the hope that maybe you'll be able to come up with the $100,000 you need to make a $500,000 project, or the $1 million you need to make a $5 million project. It's just not good business, and it involves you in a lot of hassle that is not going to make your life pleasurable. It's not going to move things forward for the project. It's not going to achieve your personal or spiritual objectives, and it's not going to make you happy when all is said and done. Your focus at this budget level has to be, will this thing make money? And if it's not going to make money, I'm not going to do it. Now, we said at the beginning, no one knows anything. It's always worth remembering, no one knows anything. Every single one of these projects at this budget level is custom made. It's like there's no such thing as an off-the-shelf film project like this. Film studios create projects that sort of are cookie cutter. They follow the same business model over and over and over again, but they're not usually little baby projects like this. They're usually much more expensive projects. Now, there have been a couple of people who've gotten really good at making, and you could do it too, that after you've produced a few $20,000 or $30,000 or $100,000 projects that make money, could well be the case you become somebody who's really good at producing $3 million or $5 million projects that always make money. Because it could be the case that you will develop a magic spell and you will find a little niche market that you can serve better than anybody else. But generally speaking, from scratch, it's not going to be the case that it's you follow this general set of steps, you'll sort of cross through these benchmarks, you'll end up with producing a project, but it's not going to be the case that every single film at this budget level is exactly the same. For example, there are some equity investment sources that want to get into a particular project before anyone is attached. It could just be the case that you want to do a film project set on Coney Island, right? You want to do a mystery project, kids mystery project set on Coney Island. And it could be the case that you happen to know some of the people that are really have a lot of control of Coney Island, and they really, it's easy for you to contact them and say, hey, I want to set a mystery at Coney Island. It'll only take me 6 weeks to produce. Now's a good time because COVID's happening, and I can produce it, it's all going to be set at night, so it'll be produced when the park's closed. Are you interested? It could be the case they go, yeah, we're interested, and yeah, we'll put money up for it because that looks like a really good investment to us. We want to make something that reminds people how cool Coney Island is, and we want to, the film itself might make money, and if that film's successful, another one might be. So the characteristics of your project may open doors that are not available to other production companies. If you happen to be a YouTube star, or you've managed to create a film project with that has an individual or a group or a corporation or a book or something attached that has a huge following already, it could be the case that people your project is just really easy to fund because it's got 1 million fans waiting to see that particular project. It could you just happen to have a standing army ready, willing, and able to go watch your particular film. And that solves a lot of problems. One, because you can do a Regulation CF campaign. You can tell people you're going to produce this particular project, and they'll go, yeah, I'll put money into that. And that's been successful in the past. There have been several films that have been produced literally by popular demand. And that, if you don't, I can probably, trying to think if there's one that I can mention right off the bat. There was one about, there's a girl mystery detective. She solves mysteries. She goes at Neptune High. She was, and the star appeared in The Good Place. Well, she was previously in this kids sort of teen detective show, and it was so successful that it got crowdfunded. They got equity investment basically from the audience to do, I think, 1 or 2 follow-on films, just because they loved the initial project, right? And it created its own funding. If you're lucky enough or you're smart enough to have put those pieces together, it'll make it much easier for you to go through this development process because you'll have a market ready, willing, and able to buy the film, and even willing to put money in up front. If you look at what the set of steps that I've run through does, you'll see that all you're really doing from the very first step all the way through the end is proving that the film's going to make money, and then attaching the elements that are going to make it make money, and then going through the process of proving to the people that have to give you money that it's going to make money, and then rolling into pre-production. So this process literally is just a step-by-step process for achieving those objectives. It's not hard, it's not complicated, it's not tedious. It's very straightforward, really, because the project either sort of makes sense or it doesn't make sense. And I recommend, if you are going to go through this process, that you actually do decide to consider walking through the process with multiple projects, just because you may find that it's a way to, if you go through this process with multiple projects, you'll see some of them are easier to put together and some of them are really hard to put together. And you don't really know that until you start to develop multiple projects. So strategies to consider. First, pick an intellectual, if you have any choice, any capacity at all, pick an intellectual property, like events, or people or topics that people really have an active interest in. It's not an accident that the Titanic was about the Titanic. Cameron didn't do a movie about a boat sinking. He did a movie about the Titanic sinking, because there's 1 billion people that know about the Titanic. It's a very compelling story. He was making a spectacle film. There's nothing that's not a spectacle film about that giant ship sinking and the iceberg, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He literally picked a popular topic to do his film about. That wasn't an accident. It was intentional, and it was because he's good at making movies. And generally speaking, try to pick one. If you acquire a book that has a huge following, it's usually one of the best things you can do if you have a piece of intellectual property that has a huge following. And the reason is that they usually have a huge mailing list, and that makes it much easier for you to do funding. And when the film actually comes out, it makes it much easier for you to let people know there's a film to go see, and it makes it so your project produces cash more quickly. So starting with good popular IP is often a great idea as well. Second strategy, consider test market something like a book or an interview or a podcast or anything else you can to see how easy or cheap it is to get people to buy something you're selling, right? If you say, look, I think this is going to be a really good project. I've got, basically, it's a mystery where Dracula is a detective. I think it's going to be a really good project. Well, if you think it's really going to be a good project, try turning it into a book and try creating trailers and creating advertisements and so forth to sell the book. See how many people you can get to buy the book, or make it available on Kindle Unlimited so it's available for free. See how many people you can drive to go read the book for free that happen to be members of Kindle Unlimited. See how many people your marketing can get to go to see that particular project. Because if it's easy and cheap for you to get them to buy the book, it's going to be easy and cheap to get them to buy the film. And that proves that there's actually a market for your work. So test market a book or an interview or a podcast or anything else to let you prove there's a market for what you're planning to sell. I know it sounds like I don't want to detour. I don't want to do something stupid like create a book. I just want to go directly to producing my film. But if you can't prove that there's a market for the work, it's going to be a problem at the beginning, and it's going to continue to be a problem for the rest of your development. Distributors are not magicians. If you are producing a Christian magical reality project, with angels and and it's the first of its kind since Narnia, distributors don't know how to market that. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But generally speaking, you're asking them to take a huge leap of faith that this thing that you've come up with that nobody's ever seen before is going to be so magical that they're going to be able to sell it. And they just don't know that. So it really makes a lot of sense. If you think that it's going to be really popular, you think it's going to be able to sustain, generate the $15 million it needs to pay a $5 million budget, then you go prove it. You take some of your hard-earned cash, you create a product to sell, and you start selling it. And I mentioned in passing, if you do this, if you do actually do this test marketing and you prove there's a market, this increases how much you can earn from the project, because it gives you books, it gives you other work that you can sell in addition to the film. Your film is probably going to sell you're going to sell it to like a streaming company, and they're going to give you sort of a fixed price, and you might sell it to other places overseas, right? But you know what? If you've produced a book and the book is available for sale, or let's say it could even be a series of books, then every time the movie sells, people are going to go find the book, and all that money theoretically could come directly to you and to your investors. The distributor is not generally speaking going to get that revenue. So in effect, the movie becomes a giant advertisement for other stuff that you sell. And it could be, instead of just selling the $4 movie, right? Because how much do most movies cost? Like $4.99 if you're going to buy them on iTunes. You could have a $4.99 movie that ends up selling 10 $4.99 books, right? So you make a lot more money with something that has a huge following, especially if you've got other products that those folks can buy. Disney makes most of its money from merchandising. A lot of their merchandising products are books. And if you're a person who has a child and you've seen Disney movies, you know exactly how many different kinds of books you can get for 101 Dalmatians, right? So test market something. Test market your project rather than deciding to dive directly into producing it. Study similar projects and duplicate what they did right. Where did they get their distribution? Who was their director? Who was their lead actor? How did the project earn money? How does it keep earning money? Good entrepreneurs steal what works. So if you're going to be producing projects at this budget level, you have to really get fascinated with other similar projects, because you want to copy the stuff that they did correctly as much as possible. You want to learn from their successes and their mistakes. Develop more than one project and do them at different budget levels. It's better to have, let's say that you've got 3 or 4 projects you could go forward with. It's kind of better for you to decide to sort of start diving into producing a $500,000 project, a $200,000 project, a $1 million project, a $3 million project, and a $5 million project. It's better to sort of come up with 5 things that you produce at different levels and sort of move forward on all of them and see which one of them people gravitate toward. See which one people find the most interesting. See which one people are most willing to support. Because what you may find is that it's a good time to produce this particular $250,000 project, but not a good time to produce this $2.5 million project. Producers usually have multiple projects they're looking at simultaneously, and they go with the thing that's going fastest. They go with the thing that moves the most quickly as a rule. Avoid and abandon problem children. When you're developing projects and starting to put together projects, and you run into any element in the project that becomes a hassle, strongly consider just abandoning them. When you're working with a writer who's a hassle, when you're working with a director who's a hassle, when you're working with an actor who's a hassle, all of these people can hold you hostage over time, right? And the only way to solve that problem is to say, okay, if you're going to be difficult about this, then I don't think we should work together on this particular project. And you should go find, I'm going to go find somebody else to work with. And your contracts that you get, your contracts need to sort of enable that. When you're working with, you've acquired a screenplay from a particular person, you need to have your contract with the screenwriter allow you to say, okay, you know, I'm going to hire you, I'm going to buy the screenplay you gave me, and I'm going to give you the ability to do the first, if I have notes and I need to make changes, I'm going to give you the ability to first chance at making those changes. But if I don't, I also want the right to be able to bring in another writer to make those changes for me. Because that means if the writer starts to be a problem, you can actually work with a writer who does what you want quickly. You need to have, you'll understand why producers are so ready, willing, and able to fire people as you start producing projects at this level. And it's specifically because you can't have somebody able to tear apart a project that you've spent 2 or 3 years building, and you can't have somebody on your project who is a threat to the life or well-being or the revenue for 50 or 100 people that might be working on the project. You can't afford to have somebody stop a project, because then it can turn, if it doesn't get finished, it becomes a dead weight loss. It means you're never going to be able to pay that money back. It's just, the project is dead, and it harms you and it harms the people you work with, and it makes producing future projects a lot harder. So be ready, willing, and able to fire people that are not working out. There's a couple of strategies to avoid. Don't try to hire someone to do development for you. There are companies that say, look, we'll handle all of this for you. If you come up with 20% of the money that you need to do your particular project and you give it to us, we'll go ahead and produce your project for you. Generally speaking, that's just not going to work out. If they could take 20% of a budget for a particular project and turn it into a film that made 3 times more than that amount of money, they would be doing that all day, every day, right? Obviously, they would just be producing all the time. The fact that they're not doing that means that the projects that they produce don't generate enough revenue. So it's easy to hand money over to people and hope that they're going to do what they're supposed to do, but generally speaking, you can't count on them to do it. And also, it's your project. You're going to be ultimately responsible. You have to be actively involved in building the production team. You have to develop it. You have to produce it. You have to make sure the distribution gets done. That's the job of being a producer. That's what producers do. Don't hire friends and hire family with specific, that don't have specific experience to help you. Hiring somebody just because they're your brother, or hiring somebody just because they're your cousin or your aunt, or hiring a friend that you've worked with for a lot of years, or making them a partner in a project, God forbid. When you hire people that don't have experience at this level, you run into a lot of problems, because there's a lot of specialized knowledge that you need. And also, it becomes difficult to let them go if they're not working out. So you want to hire people who have worked on your kinds of projects for lots and lots and lots of years, if at all possible. You want them to have experience profitably producing projects similar to yours. And you want to make sure that you've got a good, strong team. You want to make sure they get paid, and they get paid what they expect to get paid. And you want to make sure that these people have the capacity to keep you and to keep one another and to keep the entire project in line. When you hire friends and family, it becomes harder to do that, because emotions get involved. You want this to kind of be as straightforward and dispassionate as it possibly can be, because you want to get the film produced. You don't want to spend a lot of time involved in very dramatic scenes involving, friends and family members fighting, and people feeling like nepotism is going to screw up their entire career. Next thing is, don't start big, start small. It's really smart to grow into being the kind of producer you want to be by doing small projects that get larger over time, because you end up with credits. They get better and better and better, And because you acquire a team of people that you can count on, you end up finding an attorney that you really like to work with. You end up finding securities folks that you really like to work with. You end up finding DPs that you really like to work with, who like to do the same kind of projects that you do. You start building a team that grows along with you and gets more and more sophisticated as you become more and more sophisticated. This translates into a much more organically sound kind of career. It's solid and it's strong because it's not something that's trying to be too ambitious too fast. It's like you don't want your first project to be your last project. So which is often what happens when you try to do a project that's too big to start with. So I'm going to go ahead and take questions in just a minute, but we have a lot of resources featuring, I've interviewed a whole bunch of people. Now, when I interview somebody, I'm not saying that, I want to be clear, you have to do due diligence on every single person you decide to work with for a couple of reasons. One, just because I like somebody doesn't mean you're going to like them. Two, just because somebody was a good company or I thought they were a good company when I interviewed them doesn't mean they're necessarily always going to be in forever a good company. Companies change. And the technologies change. What used to be the case, you could give a 2K film was just fine. Now, when you're talking to distributors, they might want 4Ks. That means your deliverables all have to change, right? So the information, the interviews and stuff are designed to provide you with information and to introduce you with the kind of people that do the kind of jobs that we've talked about, like line production, places to get in, people who've gotten investors in the past, or you can get investors, places, companies you can work with to hire people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. My objective is to introduce you to a culture full of people and to introduce you to a whole bunch of different kinds of options so that you can actually enter the development process knowledgeably. When people talk to you, you're not surprised by what they say because you've actually heard all of these people talk, you've heard them discuss these issues, and they've given you their insight. And that prepares you to learn what you need to do in order to do your particular project. Cool. And I'm going to go ahead and let's see. Stop sharing my screen real quick. Cool. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at quick, see if anybody has any particular questions. I'll check the Q&A box. Cool. And the first question is, predictably, I don't have 20% of my budget in the bank. How am I going to produce my project? Okay, that's a very common thing. The place that most people get the first 20% they need to produce their project is generally family and friends and people they've done business with in the past. So they've created those relationships over time. And again, if you're starting with something small, it's a little bit easier. For example, let's say you do want to do a $500,000 project. You're only looking for $100,000. It's a different thing than looking for $1 million. Also, getting a $500,000 project out the door, it's not ridiculously difficult. People have done a lot of $500,000 ghost stories or $500,000 thriller films, low budget thriller films that have been pretty interesting. And if you look around at low budget projects that have done well, you will find that they have a set of characteristics in common. Usually they have very limited locations. Usually they have very, very limited casts. They might only have 5 people or 10 people. They usually are set at, they might be set at a farmhouse. So you can have the farmhouse itself, you can have the barn, and you can have like the area around the farm. So they're usually set in those kinds of locations, or they're set in an office building. So people just had to rent the office building for the weekend. They have certain characteristics, very limited locations, very limited cast, and sometimes they're found footage films, which means that it's the quality of production. You're not looking for the highest quality of production. It's like Paranormal Activities was sort of shot on what looked like security cameras because they were trying to determine whether or not their house was haunted. So they had security cameras and watching them get pulled out of bed and thrown across the room and stuff like that, or whatever, right? So you can design your project to be easy to shoot. And if you look at the frugal production, the frugal producer information we provided, it sort of dives deep on making your project easier to produce. But if you don't have 20% and you can't figure out how to get it, then it's time to start thinking about producing a different project, you know, and maybe one that you can produce for less money. Cool. So the next question is, when do I hire a casting director to approach named talent? That's an actually interesting question. It is possible to hire a casting director to contact people for you. They tend to be very protective of their reputation. So they're going to ask questions like, well, do you have your budget in place? You know, like, are you ready to produce? Because they've been burned a lot of times by people who say, I want to produce this particular project, reach out to Tom Hanks for me. And it's like, okay, one, I'm not going to reach out to Tom Hanks for you because someday I might want to reach out to him with a real project. And if I reach out to him with projects like yours, which are not real, he's never going to take my call. Two, Tom Hanks has certain requirements that I know your production's not going to be able to meet. You know, when you hire, as your talent gets bigger, they demand more and more from you. So, and frankly, a lot of them don't have the personal relationships that they need. So generally speaking, one reason that a lot of producers hire directors first is that if you hire a director who's an expert in your particular genre, then he will have access to actors that like working with him. And he can say, okay, for this particular project, I think it would be good to reach out to this guy and this guy and this guy. Alternatively, if you have a good director attached and he's got a good reputation, then when you reach out to a particular agent or manager and say, hey, we have this director attached and we want to work with this particular actor, the agent says, okay, well, if you actually have this director attached and he actually is saying that he wants to work with my particular actor, that seems like you're pretty real. I will probably go ahead, and if you've got an offer, I'll take that offer to my client because it's real, because you seem legitimate. But again, they'll also be asking questions like, do you have all your money in the bank? Are you actually greenlit, etc. You may find that you and your director reach out to managers rather than agents first, because managers are sort of in the business of developing careers where managers may be more willing to bring your independent project to the talent that you want to approach. Cool. And let me see if there's anything else. All right. So somebody wants to know, where do I find investors? We're going to be talking about funding in our next class, our next event. And when we talk about funding, we'll be talking about the platforms where people who want to invest in film or want to invest in other speculative projects hang out. And it's easy to find investors if you've got a good project. It's easier to find investors than it ever has been in the past. You don't necessarily have to know people. You can find people online using the platforms set up to be a legal place for investors to meet entrepreneurs. So we'll be talking about that sort of next week. All right. If anybody has any questions that I haven't answered, I hope you reach out to me at nancy@nancyfultonmeetups.com. And I very much look forward to hearing from you. I hope that this particular topic has been useful to you, and I hope it makes producing your projects easier going forward. And I hope that if I've discouraged you from producing your project, I hope you'll realize what I'm saying is not that you can't produce your project. I'm saying you can produce projects. You can even produce the project you want to produce. Just you may want to grow into it first. And I think it's better to think about that. I don't want to tell people to produce projects that they shouldn't produce, that I know for a fact are going to be a hassle for them. I like it when projects get finished, and I like it when projects make money. I'm assuming that you want that too. And I think that you might as well go ahead and produce projects that are going to go forward easily, as opposed to do ones that are going to be hard. All right, guys. Bye-bye.